This is one of the worst baseball games ever created, and yes, it is worse than it looks. Quattro Sports Baseball Pros is an infamously bad game. Because of the way the game is programmed, fielding is just about impossible. And the soundtrack is this really annoying loop that never ends. Yeah, that was really bad. Honestly, I'm probably going to have to limit the number of clips from this game that I show you guys just to preserve your sanity. I mean, this game is just totally horrendous. And it's even worse when you consider that this game was released in 1992. But there's also a really crazy story behind it. Quattro Sports really goes back to a British company called Codemasters that you might have heard of, especially if you're interested in old and obscure computer games. I'm talking about games like this one, BMX Simulator for the Commodore 64. This is one of those games that came on a cassette tape, and you know that you're old school if you remember these bad boys. Of course, since it was a British company, Codemasters focused more on games like 4 soccer simulations. This one was for the old Sinclair ZX Spectrum. And as you can see here, it came again on cassette tapes, not on floppy disks. So why release stuff on tape? Well, it's cheaper. That's the reason why. You see, Codemasters was one of those bottom-of-the-line, ultra-cheap companies. It's very similar to another company I've looked into on a different channel called US Gold, which was another British-based company despite the name. They mostly ported games that were made by other people and sold ultra-cheap cassette tape versions of those games. So you can think of Codemasters as sort of like the British equivalent of LJN. And these games really are awful. I can't stress that enough. This is a 1988 DOS port of that 4 soccer simulations game, which is why the graphics are the way that they are. And you don't even need me to tell you how bad this is. You can just see for yourself. Now, a lot of people on YouTube have talked about what's happened next, but we're all about full context here at the Baseball Replay Journal. So I'm going to tell you the parts of the story that people like the gaming historian and the angry video game nerd actually missed or skipped over. That's because the real story behind this is actually more interesting than you think. Codemasters had an agreement with a company from Ontario, Canada called Camerica. Wikipedia will tell you that Camerica originally sold pottery wholesale after it was founded in April 1987. By summer 1988, however, Camerica was selling what it called the Freedom Stick, which was a wireless controller compatible with the Nintendo Entertainment System. Now, the Freedom Stick is pretty obscure. It looks just like the NES Advantage, and Nintendo was really upset. I think there was a lawsuit about this, right? The interesting thing here is that the Freedom Stick was the second Nintendo accessory that Camerica sold. The first was something called the Turbotronic, and it's hard to find information about this because there was also a vacuum cleaner called the Turbotronic. Anyway, this is apparently somewhat rare. The Turbotronic is this baby, and props to you if you own one, since I haven't been able to find any for sale. It had 2 different kinds of plugs, one for the NES and one for the Sega Master System or earlier Atari systems. And as you can see from the box, this was clearly a Camerica product. Anyway, the Freedom Stick was an upgrade because it was completely wireless, except for the receiver that you had to plug in, of course. Anyway, the promise of a wireless controller got newspapers very interested. Of course, the $69.95 cost was pretty steep, even for something that used the latest technology. So the controller stuff, that's the stuff that got Camerica on Nintendo's radar from the beginning. And it's sometime around here that Codemasters and Camerica decided to sign an agreement. Now, there's this story about Camerica allegedly wanting to meet with Nintendo at Consumer Electronics Show sometime in the late 80s, but not being able to get an appointment. So for whatever reason, Codemasters and Camerica decided that they would work around Nintendo instead of having to sign one of Nintendo's third-party licensee agreements. And so, like they started to try to reverse engineer the system. As you probably already know, the big problem was this chip right here, the NES lockout chip. That lockout chip would only open up the system to cartridges that had a chip with the key, effectively locking out other third-party developers. As you remember, Tengen got around the lockout chip by obtaining the blueprints through a legal trick. This was later ruled illegal in court. Early Camerica games like Linus Spacehead had to use a different approach. And so the cart would send a shock to temporarily disable the lockout chip, and there were 2 possible kinds of shocks depending on what revision NES you had. The whole thing was terribly complicated, and it really was a bad idea. You see, the problem with those shocks is that it could fry the NES if it missed the lockout chip, or if the NES had no lockout chip at all. So to this day, you do not want to play any of these Camerica games on any of the top-loader NES consoles or any of the ones that were made by third parties recently, because it can destroy the system and will do so. Now, making bootleg games was not enough for Camerica and Codemasters. The companies also got involved with Galoob to make one of the most notorious add-ons in the history of video games. The game Genie was absolutely revolutionary when it came out. Basically, the game Genie would get in between your NES game and the system and let you override the code that was stored in the ROM. As this helpful Redditor pointed out, the game Genie basically would translate the code you entered into a value that would override what was stored in the ROM, letting you have like more extra lives or something similar. And on the NES, the game Genie could also modify the values held in the system's RAM, which is why you could be like invincible in certain games. Now, the system got through the lockout chip simply by passing through the chip data from the cartridge you connected to it into the NES. But there were problems. There were especially problems with the pin connectors. So if you use the game Genie too often on any given NES, you would eventually need to use it every single time that you wanted to play the game. It's because it would like bend the connectors in the inside of the NES. It's an awful problem. And they had to keep updating that Game Genie booklet every time new games came out, which became a huge hassle. The biggest problem, though, is that it attracted a lawsuit. Nintendo filed a lawsuit right after the device was released in May 1990. A federal judge granted Nintendo an injunction which prevented the game Genie from being sold in the United States for quite some time. And so for Christmas 1990, the only place you would see ads like this were in Canadian newspapers and magazines. In fact, Camerica went so far as to create a Thank You Canada ad to call out the fact that the courts only bowed to Nintendo's wishes in the United States. Okay, now I need to point out here that this was not like a small company that was fighting against the mammoth Nintendo. You have to remember that Game Genie had the backing of Galoob, and Galoob was anything but a small company back in those days. Galoob was actually one of the biggest toy companies in the world, which meant that this really was a battle of the heavyweights. Galoob was later associated with things like the Power Rangers, but back in 1990 it was chiefly known for Micro Machines. You used to see small toy cars like this in big box stores everywhere, and unopened boxes are a collector's item these days. And there were tons of accessories like travel cities and other bits of plastic associated with the Micro Machines. There was also an NES game put out by Camerica, and I'm sure that you can see the pattern here. This is actually one of the best racing games on the NES, but it's got that same zapping feature to defeat the lockout chip. So don't get too excited if you've got one of those Game Genie units or if you have one of those old Camerica cartridges hanging out at home. The thing is that these things are really not that rare. Sometime in the summer of 1991, a judge ruled in favor of Galoob and that injunction was lifted. And then you no longer had to, head up to Canada to get your Game Genie for your NES. However, Camerica was not done messing around with the NES, and that's where Quattro Sports comes in. From what I can tell, Quattro Sports was first sold sometime around December 1991 up in Canada, and remember that these are Canadian prices. Zoom out a little bit though, and you'll see that most kids were excited about something else. It's kind of hard to tell just how popular this game was, but I'm convinced that the early distribution was limited to Canada only since it's only listed in Canadian newspapers. And you have to be careful since Codemasters released a different Quattro Sports in the United Kingdom in early 1991, except that this one had a skiing game instead of a baseball game. Now, if you know your NES history and if you've played your bootleg games, you know for a fact that multi-card games are a really bad idea and that they never turn out well. And Quattro Sports is no exception. The 4 sports games in this cartridge are simply horrible. I'm talking like unfinished horrible, something that honestly, seriously, should never have been released. So you remember how horrible 4 Soccer Simulations was, right? Well, Soccer Simulator on Quattro Sports is the same thing, except it's somehow worse. So you kick this pizza around and you hope that the camera angles don't totally screw you over. I'd rather have my eyes poked out than play this game again. And I'm not even going to bother with the BMX and the tennis games. Anyway, I've done enough building up here, so let's just dig in and take a look at Baseball Pros and see how bad this game really is. Okay, so I've already mentioned the music, which is the first thing that you'll notice. Now the music is a little bit different when you select your team, and you've got some of the best fictional team names in baseball video game history right here. And the game has full rosters for each team, though I don't think there's any way for you to, change your lineup. But that doesn't really matter since you're not going to play this game more than once anyway, and you probably won't finish the game the first time you play it. One of the first things you'll notice is that the controls are extremely delayed, which makes it very difficult to hit. The fielders are really slow, which means you'll be able to get a bunch of singles as long as you can make contact. But of course, making contact is a real problem with this game, there's no doubt about that. So the batter-pitcher matchup is one of those ways you can tell good baseball games from horrible baseball games, especially if it's 8-bit, right? Remember like Bo Jackson baseball where you can't figure out what to do? Well, the good games make it obvious to you when the ball is coming, how to time things so you can hit it. But games like Baseball Pros seem like they just want to trick you. When you're pitching, you'll discover that the ball is almost impossible to control. Seriously, if you try to throw a curveball, you'll see the ball zig and zag around like it's possessed. Throw anything down the middle though and the computer will hit it. Fielding in this game is unbelievably bad, mostly because you can only control one fielder at a time. And so routine pop-ups like this become base hits because you literally cannot move your right fielder until the last second. So I've gone off before about games like Major League Baseball and Roger Clemens MVP Baseball. I mean, you guys already know about all this. But the fielding in this game is simply the worst in the history of 8-bit baseball games. It is beyond bad. It makes both of those games look good. There's nothing out there worse than this. I mean, it's just impossible. And that's not even the most ridiculous thing about this game. For some strange reason, the computer is programmed to steal home every time there's a runner on third base. Now, you probably remember me talking about Game 1 of the 1955 World Series, where there were 2 attempted steals of home. Billy Martin was thrown out, but Jackie Robinson's attempt was successful. It's one of the most famous plays in World Series history. In this game, however, the computer tries to steal home every chance it gets. And this becomes absolutely tedious after a while. The computer manager in this game is just broken. That's all I can say about it. It's just simply broken. They broke it when they made it. When you get to the second inning, the computer will change pitchers even though it's only got 3 pitchers in the bullpen. When you get to the third inning, the computer will change pitchers again. This happens at the beginning of every single inning. The computer will keep doing this even when it's out of relief pitchers. And the really funny thing about all of this is that it doesn't really matter in the end because there's actually no pitcher fatigue in this game. You can play through the game all you want and you'll be able to throw fastballs all the way through. I mean, it feels like this thing was programmed by like a middle school student. The worst part of this game is that the shadow doesn't show you where the ball will land. In a good game like Baseball Stars, you can follow the shadow of the ball to catch the fly ball. This goes back to Famista and is one of the key elements that helps the fielding system actually work. When you can't judge where the ball is going to land, fielding literally becomes impossible. So usually I would tell you guys that Nintendo's seal of quality doesn't mean anything, and it really doesn't usually mean anything. Like I said, Major League Baseball, Roger Clemens MVP Baseball, you know what I'm talking about. But here, that seal of quality did mean something. I have a funny feeling that Nintendo would have never allowed this hunk of junk to be released if it had any say. I mean, this game isn't like just bad, this is just unfinished. It's just horrible, absolutely horrible and unplayable. It's the video game equivalent of AI slop. Fortunately, it's easy to hit home runs, so you will score a lot of runs. Sadly, you'll give up even more home runs since the pitching system is also impossible. And heaven help you if you get in a rundown. A pickle like this could last a couple of minutes before you're either safe or tagged out. After a half hour of playing, I quit my only attempt at this game in the 6th inning. I was down by a 27-13 score. Now, the strange thing about Quattro Sports is that there were actually 2 versions of this game. One was the gold cartridge with that like switch on the back, and stuff like that. And then the other one doesn't even look like an NES cartridge at all. And I'm quite certain that both were released in at least some form. The smaller version looks like this, almost like it's a Sega Genesis cartridge. This was designed for the Aladdin Deck Enhancer. In theory, the Deck Enhancer was supposed to increase the memory the NES had, making it at least somewhat competitive with the Super Nintendo. The reality is that this hunk of junk was basically an oversized way to bypass the famous lockout chip. Now, it's not quite clear to me how widespread the release of the Aladdin Deck Enhancer actually was. The thing is that Camerica went out of business sometime in 1993, and I spent a lot of time trying to figure out exactly when this was. The problem is that I can't find any articles about it going out of business. It's totally crazy, right? You have all these articles about, oh, this company's making like this crazy wireless controller, and they're making all these great games, and it's Canadian pride and all this stuff, and then the company goes out of business and everybody forgets about them right away, right? Now, if you go on eBay, you do a search for this stuff, what you'll find is that there are a bunch of collectors out there selling fully boxed units of the Aladdin Deck Enhancer. Many of them are brand new, like still sealed brand new. You'll have a really hard time finding any used ones that some kid was playing with back in the day, and that's a sign that this might not have ever officially been released. According to the newspaper articles I could find, it seems that Camerica was planning on a release sometime in January 1993. The idea was to charge $50 for the Aladdin and then something like $20 for each game. By 1993, however, this was the only Aladdin that you would hear anything about. You could still find stores advertising the old game Genie as late as October 1993. For example, this is from Toronto. However, people who look closely at the newspapers would have noticed these announcements about liquidizing Camerica's inventory. So these things started to show up in the summer of 1993, and my guess is that a lot of the Aladdin Deck Enhancers that were sold only were sold through these liquidators. Anyway, that was the end of Camerica, and that's the end of the Camerica story. Honestly, given how bad Baseball Pros is, as well as Camerica's other games, except for Micro Machines, that one's good, but all the rest are awful. Like, given how bad this stuff is, we are probably in the end better off with the demise of this company. Now, it is kind of strange when you think about it, though, because the thing is that the game Genie by 1992-93 was at the height of its popularity, right? They won the trial with Nintendo. They were able to get the thing released in the United States. They had this coming out for like the Game Boy, the Game Gear, the Sega Genesis, and on and on and on. And then it just disappeared because the company went out of business. I mean, I guess this is poor business management. I don't know. I haven't been able to find any actual information about it. But I do think that this shows us one thing, and that is that really crappy games will not make you a successful company, even if you make them really cheap.